Hello, and welcome to this week's fun and exciting edition of Theology Thursday. I am joined as ever and always by my brilliant colleague and friend, the Reverend James Smith, rector of Trinity Episcopal Church in Three Rivers and pastor of St. John's Lutheran Church, also in Three Rivers. How are you, Pastor James?
Cheers, I'm doing great. How about yourself, Pastor Chris of Messiah Constantine?
Yeah, I didn't introduce myself, did I?
Yeah, I make that mistake too.
You have coffee, I have water.
Yeah, but the coffee is all gone. Why is the coffee always gone?
Because you drink it all? I don't know. I'm a bad Lutheran.
Let me tell you, I'm real jealous of you having a full water bottle going into this show, though, and I would like to get it for myself.
This is not full.
You're missing the segue, my friend. It was totally dropped. I'm taking over the airplane right now. Okay, so today we're talking about the 9th and 10th commandments, which are about coveting, right? Wanting what you don't have. So there are two things we're not supposed to covet: your neighbor's house and everything else. The 9th commandment, and I'm going to tee this up for you, Pastor Chris, so be ready to read. You are not to covet your neighbor's house. What is this?
Well, we are to fear and love God, Pastor James, so that we do not try to trick our neighbors out of their inheritance or property, or try to get it for ourselves by claiming to have a legal right to it and the like, but instead be of help and service to them in keeping what is theirs.
Sounds familiar, but moving on, we'll go on to the 10th commandment. You are not to covet your neighbor's wife, male or female servant. I believe the older translation has the word handmaid for a word that has been in the news lately. Also not to covet your neighbor's cattle or whatever is his. And I'm sorry, it does say his. What does this mean?
We are to fear and love God, Pastor James, so that we do not entice, force, or steal away from our neighbors, their spouses, household workers, or livestock, but instead urge them to stay and fulfill their responsibilities to our neighbors. Was I not having this conversation? Who was I having this conversation with recently? Where a neighbor, like, the cat got out and a neighbor kept their cat?
Oh.
I was just having this conversation recently. If you've read Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, he had that done. Somebody stole his dog that way. Somebody enticed his dog away from him.
Wow. So Luther thought ahead for that. Well, and so did Moses.
So did
and God.
Yeah. Well, and so, I mean, let's talk about that seriously, because, you know, there's a way in which, and full disclosure in the pregame audience, Pastor James and I may have listened to a comedic routine which was not entirely, shall we say, church appropriate, from the late George Carlin, his comedic reflections on the Ten Commandments. And he says, actually, that not coveting is stupid. He uses stronger language, but just go with it for now. Yeah. He says that not coveting is stupid, right? And I'll give you an example. Last week, yes, that's right, last week, Star Trek Picard came out on Blu-ray. Now, of course, I want Star Trek Picard because it's Star Trek, and I own all of Star Trek on disc. That's what keeps the economy going, right? Because I have what I want, what I don't have. In the words of a different James, Pastor James, not you, a different James. I want what I do not have, so I murder, right? That's what it says?
Yeah, James escalates things very quickly.
Throughout his book, throughout his short 5 chapters.
Yes. People think Paul's a drama queen. James is even worse, I would say.
But I mean, isn't that what keeps the economy going? And that's the argument ultimately that George Carlin makes. That coveting is what makes the economy go, right? You have it, so I want it, so I go out and buy one.
Yeah. So Luther has a very different take on it because he's living before a market economy. But Luther also has this strange idea that we're all sinners, which is not a bad thing because Christ saves sinners. So his idea is, well, I'll just read the man himself in the English translation brought to us by our friends Kolb and Wenger. This last commandment, I think he means specifically the 10th, but really both. This last commandment, therefore, is not addressed to those whom the world considers wicked rogues, but precisely to the most upright, to people who wish to be commended as honest and virtuous, because they have not offended against the preceding commandments, like stealing and lying and murdering.
Yes.
And he gives example as today the nobles, lords, and princes do even more. They see themselves as these upright and virtuous people. So it's kind of a commandment for the rest of us to break if you think you're doing well on all of the others, because as St. George of Carlin said, this coveting is what keeps the economy going, at least in his time and in our time that's the case. But I think the Ten Commandments also see the way that it may keep the economy going, but at what cost to our minds and our souls.
And other people's bodies, right?
Yeah,
so
well said.
Where were my cheaply made products? Who made them? Where did they come from? How did they come to be in my possession? Why are they so inexpensive?
Right. Where have all the bookstores gone?
All the Barnes and Nobles, you mean?
Barnes and Nobles is, yes. And because it's easier to buy something on Amazon.
I didn't actually become enamored with Amazon until I lived in the middle of Missouri, and buying Star Trek discs would have cost me like more money, but also most of a day.
Right.
Because
right.
I didn't live someplace where I had easy access to that stuff.
And I'm being a little unfair too, just because I'm kind of fanatical on this issue, but obviously I am just as covetous as anyone else, probably more covetous than Pastor Chris. Different covets. I'm not a Star Trek fan, but food, craft beer, you've seen me consume both of those things on this show already, so books that I probably won't read. They're just all kinds of opportunities for this one. I like what you did with the cost to our neighbors, but I also think of just again the kind of what I said about the damage it does to our own mind and own soul when we put all our hopes and dreams into stuff, so that's certainly the case with the 9th commandment. With the 10th commandment, I think it's interesting that it's really us coveting other people. It's just, we talked about objectification earlier. I think that's certainly in play here. Why do you covet a wife or a manservant or a maidservant or livestock? It's usually for what you can get out of them. And you can take
is nature that no one wants someone else to have as much as he or she does. Yeah. Everyone tries to accumulate as much as he or she can and lets others look out for themselves. We brazenly dare we hunt for and think up clever tricks and shrewd tactics. Better and better ones are devised daily under the guise of justice. We brazenly dare to boast of it and defiantly insist that it should not be called rascality, but shrewdness and foresight. Yeah. In this, we are abetted by jurists and lawyers. Ooh, jurists and lawyers. My lawyer friends are having a conniption, I'm sure, who twist and stretch the law to suit their purpose, straining words and using them for pretexts, without regard for equality or for our neighbor's plight. This occurs most often in lawsuits, in which someone sets out to gain and squeeze something out of a neighbor. You sure Luther wasn't born today?
Yeah. It's still, I'd say more timely than ever at this point. I also want to pick up on something that I think is important for understanding the commandment. The most plain use of the word covet is not just desire, but also kind of scheming and planning to get it. And that's what he's picking up on with the idea of dragging the lawyers into the argument here. Lawyering up is not just desiring, but then start the beginnings of acting on that desire. So maybe you're either not at stealing yet, or in the eyes of the law, it's not stealing, but you're plainly trying to have something that belongs to someone else. So that's the first use, but I do think the commandment really does get down to desire. In the Hebrew word that's used here, and I forget what it is, but it's also used, God covets the people of Israel. So that's desire well placed. So this one, a lot of the commandments so far, they're initially about outward actions, and then they can kind of be applied interiorly. And this is one that really goes straight to the heart from pretty much the word go.
Therefore, he sets it forth in plain words, you shall not covet, etc. Above all, he wants the heart to be pure, even though, as long as we live here, we cannot accomplish that.
Oh no. I'm going to mute myself.
So I will just continue to read then. The same thing also happens in ordinary business dealings, where people cunningly filch something out of another's hand so that the victim is helpless to prevent it, or seeing an opportunity for profit, perhaps where a person, because of adversity or debt, cannot hold on to property nor sell it without a loss, they hustle and harass the person until they get it for half price or less. And yet this is not considered to be as something acquired or obtained illegally, but rather as legitimately purchased. Hence the sayings, first come, first served, and take care of yourself and let the others take what they can.
Yeah. Luther is not afraid to expose the shallowness of conventional wisdom. like that first come, first serve is really just kind of a justification in a way if you think about people who have to work and can't get there, or people who have families and can't get in the Black Friday line at 6 a.m. on Thanksgiving Day. And we don't think of it that way, but I think that's the entire point, is there are so many things that we take for granted that Luther would say really ought not be.
However these things may happen, we must learn that God does not want you to deprive your neighbor of anything that is theirs, so that they suffer a loss while you satisfy your greed, even though before the world you can retain the property with honor. To do so is underhanded and malicious wickedness, and as we say, it is all done under the table, so as to escape detection.
Literally in German, under the hat. And there's a great footnote that their word for under the hat, it actually has connotations of sorcery, like you're pulling a rabbit out of your hat or whatever. Yeah. Hey, here's your pro. You know how we always say wash your hands? We're still saying that. But pro tip number 2, always read the footnotes. You never know what you'll find.
Yeah, literally under the hat, a proverbial expression derived from sorcery. Sorry, the electronic version means reading the footnotes takes a little more effort.
Yes. Unter dem Hut.
Although you may act as if you have wronged no one, you have certainly trespassed on your neighbor's rights. It might not be called stealing or cheating, but it is coveting. That is, having designs on your neighbor's property, luring it away from them against their will, and begrudging what God gave them.
Yeah. So what should we? I think we're both agreed on this. We're that A, coveting is bad. B, we do it, and C, that's not great. But I wonder. Every time there's not just a negative, but a positive. So what is the positive spin of what we're supposed to be doing on this one? Is it thinking happy thoughts? Or what does Luther say we should be doing?
If I may, this then is the common meaning of this commandment. First, We are commanded not to to harm our neighbors, nor to assist in doing harm, nor give occasion for it. Instead, we are gladly to let them have what is theirs and promote and protect whatever may be profitable and serviceable to them, just as we wish others would do for us.
That can be, I'm just going to own it. I think that can be really hard for a lot of people in a time of radical wealth disparity. When you've got the top doing very well, who clearly do not obey this commandment because they cheat on their taxes, or don't pay their workers a living wage. So there's this covetousness. I think both from rich and poor, kind of the covetousness builds resentment and distrust between the two. And I don't think it's as easy as saying don't covet, because Luther says how hard that is. But just to recognize that there really are ill effects to the whole idea that's kind of in the air in America, that whoever dies with the most toys wins at the end of the day.
Well, and Luther's pretty clear. This doesn't, so with the wealth disparity, this doesn't apply to the people at the bottom. This applies to the people at the top. The people at the bottom, he would say, are in the preceding commandments, right? If your neighbor is rich and leaves out his bicycle and you steal it, actually, apparently bike theft is on the rise. I was thinking about it. I am probably thinking about that because I read an article about it this morning, but it's not okay because you're Robin Hood, but that's stealing, not coveting,
right. Right, I guess I would say, I think the stealing is the problem that comes to Luther's mind immediately for people living in poverty, but I think there's also a lot of covetousness and resentment that he's not really grappling with here. Because his focus really is kind of that paragraph I read at the start. If you're not feeling guilty already because you're rich enough not to steal, well, get ready, it's your turn. But I think coveting is, I'm not going to say a universal problem. Some people rise above it, but it's a problem that I don't think just exists among the rich.
It would still be more about equals, though, right? Competing with each other than it would be about disparates, right? Because a rich person really, the rich person already has the legal system on his or her side.
It's a good question.
I hadn't considered it. I'm speaking out loud, so I could be wrong there.
Certainly in Luther's time they did, and I would say by and large they do in America too. I'm not naive about that, but I do think if you look at like economic populism, is that justice or is that covetousness or is it both? It probably depends upon your perspective, what's motivating you. There are people who genuinely are just mad at the rich and want to see them suffer. Then there are others who genuinely want to have enough money to put food on their table and pay for health care. I think the first one is a form of covetousness.
It's funny, I was just reading Against the Murdering and Robbing Hordes of Peasants. No, I was just reading the reply to the Swabian peasants this afternoon. No, it was this morning. It was before I left.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not exactly sure when I did what. But I was definitely just reading that. And that's exactly what Luther says at the beginning of the reply to the 12 Articles of the Swabian Peasants.
And I forget, I think Large Catechism's written before that, so he may not even have that. I think it was Large Catechism 1530 and then 1535.
Between 1528 and 1530, yeah.
Yeah, so I wonder if the type of issue I'm raising and was raised on the murderous thieving hordes of peasants is something that he had yet to really experience at that point.
Maybe.
Yeah. Anyway, I think on the whole, you're right. This is a problem more for well-to-do people, but I'm very equal opportunity when it comes to breaking the commandments. I think that we can all break them all in our own way, because I certainly do.
Above all, he wants the heart to be pure, even though as long as we live here, we cannot accomplish that.
Yeah.
So, Pastor James, I feel like we've wrapped up the 10 Commandments. What more could there possibly be to say?
So there's a postscript, just in case you didn't get enough out of this. I'm going to read the small catechism version of the postscript. The large catechism version is actually better, but it's longer, so maybe we can tackle a couple points that we want here and there. So Luther writes all this, and then he says, "What then does God say about all these commandments?" Answer: God says the following: I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, or zealous God is kind of the sense. Against those who hate me, I visit the sin of the fathers on the children up to the third and fourth generation. But I do good to those who love me and keep my commandments to the 1000th generation. What is this? Answer: God threatens to punish all who break these commandments. Therefore, we are to fear his wrath and not disobey these commandments. However, God promises grace and every good thing to all those who keep these commandments. Therefore, we also are to love and trust him. One callback for some of our famous words, and gladly act according to his commands.
So
I think that's important because we've had this phrase, fear and love God, all the time. And I have seen fear made into, it just means reverence. And that may be the way that people today would rather interpret it, but it's not the way Luther sees it in the Catechism. I think we need to be honest about that he really does believe God punishes wickedness, and that we should fear God for it. One way I've heard this talked about is that fearing God is actually a bit liberating, because if God is the one thing you fear, then you don't have to worry about what all these other things in the world are going to do to you.
Well said.
Yeah. So I know fearing God isn't popular. I'm sorry. I also just think, whether you believe that God is really got his telescope out looking down below, and punishing, you did that, I'll smite you with this plague or whatever. I think that we see the consequences of not living with these commandments every day. So maybe the punishment is just that God has designed a universe where, things like adultery, murder, stealing, covetousness, disobedience, they may not get you right now in your particular situation, but they do lead to a society that's less just, less peaceful, less loving.
Well, let's talk about that, right?
Okay.
Against those who hate me, I visit the sin of the fathers on the children, up to the third and fourth generation. And it wasn't all that long ago in the Sunday texts, but you have heard this proverb repeated in Israel. The parents, fathers, have eaten sour grapes, and the children's sons' teeth are set on edge. But I say to you that the life of the father and the life of the son are mine, and every man shall pay for his own sins. I think that's Ezekiel 33, but I wouldn't swear to it.
I think you're right.
And and I've said this in sermons before. I think it is true that children do pay for the sins of their parents.
Oh yeah.
And the easiest example that comes, or the first example that comes to my mind, is fetal alcohol syndrome.
Yep.
Right. And that's just one example.
What about kids who have to grow up, and you could look at this depending on the situation, either as a parent sin or as a social sin, but the massive incarceration rate in this country, and growing up without one or two parents, depending on who you are, that's a major step back. So Jeremiah actually agrees with the proverb Ezekiel argues against, and this Ten Commandments clearly agrees with the proverb Ezekiel's arguing against. And I agree with you, Pastor Chris. At least what I hear you saying, I think the children absolutely do suffer from the sins of the parents, and I think Ezekiel, we might get sidetracked for a minute, but I think it's worth saying. Ezekiel is trying to say, don't blame someone else for the bad that's happening to you right now. You are just as guilty. So he's speaking into a specific context at that time. But I think if you just take a step back and look at the way the world actually works, I think it's obvious. Like I don't see how you can argue the other way.
Well, and so that's the appendix to the 10th commandment in the small catechism. But in the large catechism, Luther refers to it as the conclusion. And it is clear that he sees this appendix as, this appendix is primarily attached to the first commandment, as we have heard above. It is intended to apply to all the commandments, and all of them as a whole ought to be referred to and directed to it. For this reason, I said that we should keep it before the eyes of young people and drum it into them, in order that they learn and remember it in such a way that we may see why we are constrained and compelled to teach these 10 commandments. This appendix ought to be regarded as attached to each individual commandment, penetrating and pervading them all. These words contain, I missed it. These words contain both a wrathful threat and a friendly promise, not only to terrify and warn us, but also to attract and allure us. Thus, the first commandment is to illuminate and impart its splendor to all the others.
Yeah. So what Luther means there is basically what you have faithfully said, week in, week out, rising early, as Jeremiah uses that phrase. Look it up in your Bible. That the first commandment undergirds all of them. The fear, love, and trust of God is what the rationale for all of them is, and the ability to keep them. Or more an explanation for why you can't keep them often is your fear, love, and trust are misdirected. Can I
Please.
Now that we've said some really depressing but I think honest things, what are some positives for the 10 Commandments? Remind me if I don't mention, ask if I'm done when I'm done, so I'll remember to bring this one up, because I want to save it for the end. The first is that they give us actual good works to do. So if you read the large catechism, he gives some works that people were doing at the time as he saw it to try to please God. Works like, here we go, yeah. Works that captivate all eyes and ears, and he's talking about the rites and ceremonies of church. So the burning of incense, singing and ringing of bells, lighting of candles and tapers, until all of this is nothing else can be seen or heard. For when a priest stands in a golden chasuble, or a layperson spends a whole day in the church on his or her knees, that is considered a gracious work that cannot be sufficiently extolled. But when a poor servant girl takes care of a little child, or faithfully does what she is told, this is regarded as nothing. So the positive side, first of all, Luther does not have a problem with ceremony. He has a problem when that becomes your get out of jail free card. Well, look at all these great things I'm doing. Like I'm in mass 7 times a day. I love a pretty chasuble. It doesn't mean I'm holier than anyone else. But the commandments give us a way to actually do things God wants of us and not things that we make up to make ourselves feel better. And they're more democratic. So bad example because I am a priest, but if you were not a priest or a monk or a nun. Luther, this is incredibly liberating because he's saying just by doing your job or just by taking care of your mom or dad, you are doing more good works than any people in the so-called religious vocations of his time. So number one, that's really good news. Number two is Luther actually argues that by faith we fulfill the commandments. Now, what does he mean? Because obviously there are many Christians and they commit many atrocities. So what he says is that faith attaches to Christ. And when we believe in God, that fulfills that fear, love, and trust first commandment. And then what happens is we give to Christ our sins when we believe in God, and he gives to us the way he has fulfilled the law. So we get to take his work as our own. And by the way, that is supposed to change us as well, although incomplete in this life. But it's a way of fulfilling the law through Christ. That's what faith does. So that's a number two good thing about the Ten Commandments. And finally, if you have been saying to yourself this entire time, well, geez, all these guys are negative Nancy's. They haven't let me off the hook one time yet. That's actually the third good reason, because they show us where we fall short so that we despair of ourselves, we despair of trying harder, we despair of even our best, noblest intentions, and rely on Christ alone, who we'll hear about when we go to the Creed. So those are my top three reasons not to hate the Ten Commandments.
Now, you told me to ask you, are you done?
Yeah, that was my soapbox.
Okay. You're sure you because I want to make sure you got all your points in.
Yes, I did.
I understand what it's like to be done and to move on, and then later to be like, and kick yourself, because I do it all.
Yeah.
I think
No,
good sermon, preacher.
Well, you and I love the Catechism, don't we?
So each of us is to make the Ten Commandments a matter of daily practice in all circumstances, all activities and dealings, as if they were written everywhere we look, everywhere we go, or everywhere we stand. Not that we need to post them on walls, all over the place, but that they are written on our hearts. Thus, for both ourselves at home and abroad among our neighbors, we will find occasion enough to practice the Ten Commandments, and no one need search far from them. And yes, I really do love the Ten Commandments. Everything that they are to teach. Oh, wait. It would be much better if morning, noon, and night preachers would instead read a page or two from the Catechism, the prayer book, the New Testament, or some other passage of the Bible, and would pray the Lord's Prayer for themselves and their parishioners. In this way, they would once again show honor and respect to the gospel, through which they have been delivered from so many burdens and troubles. And they might feel a little shame that, like pigs and dogs, they are remembering no more of the gospel than this rotten, pernicious, shameful, carnal liberty.
Wow.
But I say this for myself, and here's Luther. I am also a doctor and a preacher, just as learned and experienced as all of them who are so high and mighty. Nevertheless, each morning, and whenever else I have time, I do as a child who is being taught the Catechism, and I read and recite, word for word, the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, the Creed, the Psalms, etc. I must still read and study the Catechism daily, and yet I cannot master it as I wish, but must remain a child and pupil of the Catechism, and also do so gladly. These fussy, fastidious fellows would like quickly, with one reading, to be doctors above all doctors, to know it all and to need nothing more. Well, this too is a sure sign that they despise both their office and the people's souls, yes, and even God and his word. Therefore, I beg such lazy bellies and presumptuous saints, for God's sake, to let themselves be convinced and believe that they are not really and truly such learned and exalted doctors as they think. It is clear, Luther clearly believes that you can never truly understand, master, and complete the Catechism. He's speaking to himself as well as to learned doctors and preachers, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And I want to say, so today, of course, is October 22nd. And I want to say that you mentioned a moment ago, Pastor Laughlin, about having it written on our hearts. If you are in a Lutheran church this Sunday, there's a good chance it'll be Reformation Sunday. And you'll hear Jeremiah about God writing the law on our hearts. And that's really, I'm sorry if I said this before, but I think it bears repeating. That's really the idea of a catechism. Catechism is from a word that means echo. The idea is you hear it and you can echo it back. So it's memory is so despised today as a way to learn. But really, I think this is something that when it is written on your hearts, when you've memorized, if not all of Luther's words, at least the words of the creed, of the commandments, of the prayer, the more you can memorize it and make it a part of your daily life, the more the Holy Spirit really is writing this law on your heart so that it becomes a part of who you are. So that's the idea of catechism, not to learn new information and to be done with it, but just to internalize it.
So I think the most full-throated defense of memorization could come from our bishop. But and it is interesting because, like, I basically stopped going to the Network of Biblical Storytellers because they call memorization the M word, and they really degrade it. And I think it's a problem if it's rote. I mean, it's like the liturgy, right? If it's rote, and as you're saying it, you're thinking about, as my mother would say, your grocery list, then you've got a problem. But if it's about knowledge, knowledge isn't necessarily bad, but it's not complete. If it's not about information, but if it's about formation, if it's about who we are, if it's, as you say, written on our hearts, then it's a different story.
Yeah. Well, and I can say, I hope these have been helpful for our viewers, but even me, I find myself during the week thinking about the Ten Commandments and chances to practice them more than I was before, just by the process of doing this together. So I think, look, Luther studied more than anyone. If he still considered himself a student of this, then there must be something to it. And that's why we are so excited to conclude this part of the catechism. It's been described as you realize what the problem is, then you go to the creed, you realize what the solution is, then you go to the Lord's Prayer and you realize how to ask for help. And so we've laid the trap for us, and I hope you'll all join us the next few weeks as we hear the creed and how God gets us out of this morass.
Well said, Pastor James. We look forward to seeing you all next week, the 29th, for Theology Thursday.
Happy Reformation Sunday.